Applied General Semantics, authored by DMW between 2021-03 and 2021-07. Warning: this material is designed for individuals who have a nagging feeling that life on Earth could be better for everyone. If you are perfectly content with your life, ignore this video. If I would talk the old jargon, I would not convey anything to you. Alfred Korzybski, sometime between 1948 and 1949. I have designed this presentation for individuals who are trying to modify their behavior so as to habitually act under the influence of something I call the relational attitude, or more simply, sanity. I expect you are an individual with some exposure to general semantics and are immediately interested in practicing it, applying it, etc., to such an extent that you can do general semantics with less conscious effort. Class begins. E prime and the failure of popularization. I am not a fan of the so-called E prime. I have seen articles about E prime posted to a place called Hacker News, and the commenters were quick to vitiate the material, posing questions like, if I can't use is, how do I ask the question, what is your name? If I can't use is, how do I answer the question, what is your name? Assuming the generally accepted response to the question goes something like, my name is such and such, etc. In Science and Sanity, on page 93, the author enumerates 11 aspects of the Aristotelian system he rejects, of which I only want to talk about item 3. On page 93, item 3, quote, the necessary confusion through lack of discrimination between the, quote, is of identity, which I reject completely, and the, quote, is of predication, the, quote, is of existence, and the, quote, is used as an auxiliary verb. From the above, we see that Korzybski recognized 4 possible usages of the syntax is. Why am I pointing this out? I am pointing this out because a major aspect of E prime is the, quote, habitual deletion of the syntax is, despite the fact that Korzybski indicated taking issue with only one usage. I appreciate E prime's focus on the mechanics of altering language habits, but I think the focus on certain words as such misses the larger goal. I will now attempt to demonstrate what I suggest doing instead of habitually deleting certain words. I choose a referent and observe it. I want to address some language surrounding what, poetically speaking, appears to be a hot racial topic in 2021, surrounding the controversy about some books written by Dr. Seuss. Answers to, quote, moral questions are not my goal. My goal is to answer questions of syntax and the interpretation of syntax. I found an example of what I call the is of identity in a, quote, statement published, according to the map provided, on March 2nd, 2021 by, quote, Dr. Seuss Enterprises. I see no name or names given to the actual authors. Below is a screenshot of the statement as it appeared on Dr. Seuss's website. I will now read this statement. Today, on Dr. Seuss's birthday, Dr. Seuss Enterprises celebrates reading and also our mission of supporting all children and families with messages of hope, inspiration, inclusion, and friendship. We are committed to action. To that end, Dr. Seuss Enterprises, working with a panel of experts, including educators, reviewed our catalog of titles and made the decision last year to cease publication and licensing of the following titles, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, If I Ran the Zoo, McElligot's Pool, On Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Eggs Super, and The Cat's Quizzer. These books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. Ceasing sales of these books is only part of our commitment and our broader plan to ensure Dr. Seuss Enterprises' catalog represents and supports all communities and families. In reference to the statement I just read, I locate a disguised is of identity and then explain my interpretation of the syntax. I now quote a portion of the statement I am interested in. These books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. The first thing I want to note is that I don't see the syntax is printed anywhere in what I quoted. I'm okay with that, because a person can employ the mechanism of an is of identity with many words. Some of these words, or aliases for the is of identity, include are, am, was, etc. When person A says, these books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong, I interpret the following. Number one, I interpret that person A has expressed a description of their opinion of something. Number two, I interpret that person A has used language in such a way that might be interpreted by others as a statement of fact. Number three, I interpret that person A has used language in such a way that might be interpreted by others that what has been said is necessarily, unequivocally, universally, always true, regardless of anything else. Number four, I interpret that person A expects that every person who reads any of the 6 books will also necessarily, unequivocally, universally, and always interpret what they are reading as portraying people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. In other words, that every person who reads these books will share person A's opinion. I call that kind of language habit allness. By allness, I mean verbal situations where there is no syntactic allocation for order, relations, sequence, evaluation, variation, etc. I locate a complex disguised is of identity and translate it. I want to argue for the moment that the syntax these books portray also exhibits the characteristics of an is of identity. I translate the following, these books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong, into, when I read these books, I interpreted them such that they portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. Why that specific translation? Because there is no such thing as, quote, these books. It is true that the authors of the statement enumerated the titles of 6 books, and so we have maps of reference for locating actual books whose existence I do not doubt. But something is missing. A person is missing. There can be no talk of, quote, these books without at least one person to be making reference to, quote, these books. And unless that person is speaking to themselves, there must be at least one additional person to be the receiver of the first person's map about, quote, these books. To talk about, quote, these books without syntactic and therefore explicit reference to at least one observer is to speak as if what is being said about something is somehow intrinsic to the something itself. To engage in that language habit is to identify what is being said as being equal in all respects with the actual thing. In other words, to identify is to ignore the distinction between the thing and the word, and to ignore the relation between the word and its speaker, and to ignore the relation between the speaker and the listener, etc. I avoid the is of identity because it is verbal fiction. I avoid verbal fiction by acknowledging the speaker. If a piece of symbolism exists, then it was authored by someone. Symbolism without reference to an author is like a masked bandit. You know someone is trying to rob you, you just don't know who. In the process of acknowledging the speaker, I translate this, quote, "these books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong," into this: when I read these books, I interpreted them such that they portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. Why do I say translate? For your own sanity. Evaluating a map that does not syntactically acknowledge the reality of its author, I find similar in structure to evaluating a map that makes no reference to an environment. I remind myself to be conscious of my abstracting when I consider maps that exclude author, date, relations, order, etc. At present, I have come to the conclusion that it is physically impossible for a human to speak about anything other than themselves. For this presentation, I will assume what I have said is true, because, in part, it provides a kind of compass for our operations. Under this assumption, quote, any map that excludes reference to its speaker must be translated. In my experience doing such translations, I almost always find multi-ordinal terms and variables. I locate variables and describe how I alter my evaluation based on their presence. I repeat the original quote. These books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. In the above map, I detect and will talk about 4 variables. Variable 1, books. Variable 1, books, is actually filled in via the referent under consideration. In other words, the statement provided by Dr. Seuss Enterprises. When I consider the whole of the statement, I feel confident saying that, quote, books has definite, findable reference, and therefore symbolizes something, and therefore is not a variable. I include it anyway for 2 reasons. I include it to remind myself to look at the territory surrounding the subject of my immediate interest. If I were to forget to do this, I might fixate on the quote itself, such that I lose sight of the author's wider message and thereby make an error myself. Number 2, I include it because, had there not been definite enumeration of the books referenced, then, quote, books would be a variable. I learned to distinguish between propositions and propositional functions. Variable 2, people. Variable 2, people, is not filled in. The authors make no reference to specific, actual, living or dead, persons, and therefore this map, as it stands, is now disqualified from being a proposition and is instead rightly interpreted as a propositional function. Propositional functions are never true and never false. No agreement regarding an event can be reached if the individuals arguing lack first-hand experience by way of measurement of the events in question. Therefore, when person A and person B choose to argue over the, quote, truth of a propositional function, then both of them have decided to engage in conflict. Because propositional functions are neither true nor false, I think it's fair to say that such conflict may well persist until one or both are dead and can no longer argue. I ask questions about variables. Variable 3, hurtful. Variable 3, hurtful, is also not filled in. Hurtful in what sense? Physical, so-called emotional, something else? Hurtful to whom? For how long? And under what conditions? When I find variables in syntax and the referents are not known to me, I allocate ample room for error in any given interpretation. When I have no first-hand experience of the events, I expect error on my part. Even when an interpretation from another speaker who has knowledge of the reference gives their map to me, I do not magically gain their first-hand experience, and so this other person's first-hand knowledge is still only inferential to me. If I were to act on my interpretation of that map, or to retransmit the map to another person with the claim that it is, quote, true, I would then be playing something I call the trust game. Transmission of symbolism is different than acquisition of knowledge. The, quote, proof of acquisition of knowledge is in one's ability to demonstrate what has been learned, to act in accordance with their interpretation of some language. Remember, explanation without demonstration I call indoctrination. I ask more questions about variables. Variable 4, wrong. Variable 4, wrong, is not filled in. Wrong in what sense? Wrong with respect to what? Wrong according to whom? Wrong as proven empirically via what experiment? Or wrong for what purpose? These questions and their answers are ignored by the authors. Instead, the authors use variables. In doing this, the authors cast the responsibility of assigning a definite value to each variable on the reader. I believe this is an example of what Korzybski called gambling on multi-ordinal terms, something philosophers and politicians, etc., are guilty of. As I practice general semantics, I exert effort to avoid engaging in these sorts of language habits. When I want to talk about something, I make an honest effort to be very clear as to what, specifically, what real, verifiable thing I am talking about. I avoid casually pushing that responsibility onto my listeners. I demonstrate a more fully formed example translation from Aristotelianism to non-Aristotelianism. The original quote, "These books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong," into, "My name is Smith, and when I read And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street in 2021, I experienced a range of thoughts, emotions, etc. When I reached page 20, I began feeling uncomfortable, specifically in response to my associations surrounding the language and imagery on that page. I describe my interpretation as feeling anxious about how some Chinese people may interpret the material. In response to my experience, I have voted, quote, agree to the question of removing commercial opportunities for this book, etc. I remind myself of what I already know. When I find myself interpreting symbolism, I use the following maps to remind myself how to proceed when trying to comprehend what the author is trying to communicate. Number 1, does the map include the speaker? Number 2, does the map include the date? Number 3, do I detect variables and/or multi-ordinal terms? Number 4, has the author announced opinions, speculations, unknowns,
etc. Number 5. Remember, explanation without demonstration I call indoctrination. Class dismissed.